This is Frankie Lynch, astrological consultant. FrankieLynch.com, at Frankie Astro on TikTok and Facebook, at Frankie Lynch 777 on Twitter. So please like and subscribe and share this video. This is a new venture for me, you too. Anyway, I wanted to take some time today to talk about historical transitions of Pluto from Capricorn to Aquarius, right? We're about to have one next year. I believe it's March 2023. So, he'll go in there, retrograde out, and go back in 2024. So what can we expect from this momentous transit? This is the first time it's happened since 1778. Pluto has a cycle of about 248 years to complete an orbit. So, of course, it's been that long since Pluto last went into Aquarius. That also means he stays in the sign about 20 years. So, it's my first house. I'm a little worried. It's going to cross my ascendant 5 times between 2024 and 2026. So, what can we expect? Well, no one really knows. But I did some fun little research analyzing Pluto transitions from Capricorn to Aquarius throughout history, going back to the Roman Empire. So we'll take a look at that just a sec. But really quickly, some background on the planet Pluto. The planet formerly, or Pluto, the former planet, I guess. So, Pluto gets its name from it's the Latinized version of Pluton, who was a Greek god of the underworld. He sort of replaced Hades over time, as Hades sort of more became the name for the underworld. So, Pluton was also often mistaken for Plutus, right? Who was the god of wealth. Plutus literally means wealth. And then Pluto's Roman counterpart was called Despater, which literally means rich father, right? So on the one hand, he's the ruler of the underworld, hence the will, the power, the death, right? Obsession, transformation, sex, right? The psychological part of sex, sexual power. But then we also have this whole wealth dimension, right? He is the Lord of the underworld. He digs deep and reveals treasures, right? Where hidden treasures are hidden deep within the ground. So he has all these lovely dimensions, and we'll see those play out throughout all these transitions in history. Okay. So why don't we take a look and briefly go through this? Here we are. What's going to happen? So I start off the paper here with when Pluto went into Capricorn last, which was 2008. So what happened then? It was the financial crash, yes? The dominance of world finance became shaky, or at least the shakiness was apparent. What we became aware of as this crisis ensued was that businesses, transnational corporations, had hollowed themselves out from the inside over years. This is a fun statistic. Between 2002 and 2012, 54% of all corporate profits went to buying back their own stock to inflate share prices. That's very Plutonian, right? Aggregating and hoarding wealth. And on the other side of the coin, with the financial crisis and the subprime mortgage crisis, essentially $90 billion was transferred from the poorest 50% to the top 1%. Again, very Plutonian, highlights the power relation. In fact, some corporations didn't even pay taxes, right? This is a wonderful TED Talk you all should watch. It's on YouTube. It's called Who Controls the World by a systems theorist, James B. Glatfelter. Essentially, he shows the concentration of wealth that happens systemically, not as the result of some conspiracy, but as the result of systems themselves. And when you don't regulate the movement of wealth, it's going to concentrate and aggregate. As a backlash to all that, we saw what? The Occupy movement, where people started to become aware and to challenge the hegemony of finance capital. So it should become clear here that at this point in time, the dominant global power is essentially finance capital. But you see, finance capital and the system of power relations has many dimensions. There's the class dimension, which we talked about here when it comes to finance and wealth. Then there's the racial dimension. And we saw the rise of Black Lives Matter during the same cycle. It erupted violently sometimes, very Plutonian. It erupted as a result of power relations and of death, unjustified death. And then another Plutonian issue is sexual violence. The Me Too movement came to prominence, right? Not too long ago, but during Pluto and Capricorn. Not only did it become apparent in show business, but all over, right? Politicians went down for this. And of course, the relations between genders, between race, these are all power relations that have to do, are part and parcel of the dominant finance capital system. So anyway, we just mentioned this because of the Plutonian dimension. So it should become apparent then that Pluto transiting through Capricorn, right, it reveals the underlying sickness, right? It erodes the dominance. It exposes the cracks and the vulnerabilities within a dominant hegemon or dominant power. So if this is the case, then we should see this throughout history, right? So let's go back a little bit, because before that, Pluto last entered Capricorn in 1762, immediately following the French-Indian Wars, right? They were quite expensive, so the British Crown wanted to recoup whatever money they could. Again, very Plutonian theme. Of course, they did that by levying a series of taxes, which were eventually called the Intolerable Act. Some of us may recall things like the Tea Act that precipitated the Boston Tea Party. Well, these acts themselves would be the cause for the American Revolution of Independence. Pluto entered Aquarius in 1778, around the time Lafayette landed to help the Americans. And little did he know, right, that the French Revolution would begin just about a decade later, right? And of course, when I think of Pluto and Aquarius, my first thought is the French Revolution, right? They challenged everything. Everything came up, right? They challenged the calendars. The Reign of Terror, how Plutonian was that? Maximilien Robespierre was a Jacobin. They were radical progressives, essentially. And they were determined to fight all enemies of the revolution. The problem was that definition of enemy became quite broad, and a lot of people met their end, including Robespierre at the end of this whole deal. So what was apparent through all this is that what was precipitating these revolutions was the rising power of the merchant class. They were getting wealth that rivaled monarchs, yet they didn't have political influence. They were the third estate, right, in French feudal politics. The monarch had the real power, and then the nobility. Those are who had political influence. The rising merchant class, or bourgeoisie as they would be called, they wanted political influence. So of course, it only became natural that they would precipitate these revolutions, you see. So this is a whole bunch of background that we could look up later. And we talk a little bit about the history of racism, right? In the history of gender relations in the colonies, yes. So we can see it was an issue even back then. We see the same Plutonian issues, right? Chattel slavery growing, right? And becoming a political issue. The suffragette movement would slowly grow, right? Now, again, we can see here how monarchies and their dominant hegemonic power eventually gave rise to the merchant class. Yeah. The Bank of England was essentially started to finance the British Crown, right? During the 100 Years' War. It was financed by and large by a merchant, a Scottish merchant. So again, it's so interesting. The dominance of the church gave way to the dominance of finance capital. Really, merchant capital and finance capital were not distinguishable at that time. It was only later. But you see, before that, Pluto went to Capricorn in 1517, which was the same year Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, which challenged church corruption. So again, we saw the erosion of church power, the exposure of church corruption. The printing press made this whole thing take off. Without the printing press, Protestantism probably wouldn't have become the wildfire it did. So Martin Luther himself, right, essentially challenged the hegemony of the dominant Catholic Church. The Bible was even printed in German, right, which made it accessible to everyone. And you didn't need a priest to mediate between you and God. The interesting thing is that the final nail went into the coffin when Pluto went into Aquarius, right around the time King Henry VIII said, "F you to the Pope, I am the head," right? The supreme head of the Church of England. That was in response to the excommunication, right? And he's like, well, who cares? Now, prior to that, there was a council called by Pope Gregory X, and they were considering reuniting the Eastern and Western Church, which is a big, wild thing because for about 1,000 years, that was the major power struggle, right? It sort of started with Diocletian towards the end of the Roman Empire when they realized it was too large to govern. So they split it up into 4 parts called the Tetrarchy. Diocletian would rule one part, his son another, Flavius would rule another, and his son Constantine another. So when Pluto went into Aquarius, though, Diocletian was quite upset to see his arrangement fall to pieces. So again, Pluto in Aquarius, we could see, creates this destabilization, but Constantine would wrest power and reunite the empire. He would establish the city of Constantinople, right? Which at the time became the center of Christendom. So there were 4 churches established, 4 basic churches: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Empire, right, its power waned and it was conquered by Frankish and German people, tribes, and and they would assume the customs for the most part of the Roman Church. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Church was flourishing and was a center of culture, right? Well, once there became only two churches, that's when the rivalry sort of started. Okay. Constantine had sort of made the Bishop of Rome, that's what he was called at the time, the most influential position of the four churches. Eventually, the Bishop of Rome would be called the Pope. Meanwhile, the Roman Emperor would be on the Byzantine side, on the Eastern Empire. So it became customary for only the Byzantines to offer up a emperor. Meanwhile, it was the duty of the Romans to offer up a pope, right? And the Pope did have to give his consent or his tacit approval to whoever the emperor was. So now what happened here towards the year 800, as Pluto went into Aquarius, Irene of Athens assumed power over the Byzantine Empire. Briefly, her husband died, and she became queen regent because her son was too young to assume power. But as he grew, their relationship got more and more contentious. Eventually, she had his eyes gouged out, and he died not soon after. And she ascended to empress. Well, the Pope of Rome didn't like that and said, well, I'm not going to accept a woman being empress. And so he basically crowned Charlemagne, this wonderful little Frankish warlord, as Holy Roman Emperor, basically declared this new thing, totally usurping any sort of power from the East. And of course, this was a big, big slap in the face. So even though the Byzantine Church had gained ascendancy at one point, the Roman Church then did later. So, and we can see a couple other things that happened, along the way, which brings us back to 1272, right, when we had that council trying to reunite the two, and it totally fell apart into conflict, right? So what does this tell us about now, right? Well, the one thing it can show us is that destabilization is a big theme when it comes to Pluto entering Aquarius. We also saw that Pluto transiting Capricorn entails the revelation of the vulnerabilities and the corruption and the sicknesses of the dominant power. And then going into Aquarius brings in an ascendant power, right, that challenges the establishment. And oftentimes there's a big struggle. It's quite interesting. I was just reading that Pluto went into Aquarius around the time of the late Bronze Age collapse, which was a monumental shift in history, right? One of the biggest shifts in history that we know of, right? So that's quite interesting too. Anyway, so do we have any better answers of what's going to happen? Well, we know it'll be a big shakeup. Uranus goes into Gemini in 2025. The last time that happened was World War II. The time before that was the Civil War. So obviously this brings in pretty crazy times. What can we do? The best we can to go on living, being good people, taking care of our families, our kids, our communities. Love each other as we love ourselves, right? Anyway, I hope this was enjoyable. This is Frankie Lynch. I love you.